Good afternoon, pro wrestling history buffs, and welcome to Pro Wrestling History Radio Daily. I'm your host, the eclectic gentleman, Stephen Watts, and join me and find out the happy birthdays, the unfortunate deaths, the title changes, and the big moments for this day in pro wrestling history. But before we get started, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now let's find out that wrestling history for February 19th. Let's start off on a positive note with those happy birthdays for February 19th. Starting off in 1937, luchador legend Humberto Garza. 1948, Big John Studd. 1958, a gentleman I actually got to wrestle on the indies in the late 90s, early 2000s, Tommy Cairo. 1969, from Tokyo, Japan, Gedo. 1972, the Queen of Extreme, Francine. 1974, speaking of ECW, Double D, Danny Doring. 1981, he's a perfect 10 and the former chairman of AEW, Shawn Spears. And last but not least, 1982, midget wrestler Mascarita Dorado. Of course, on the flip side of that coin, your pro wrestling deaths for February 19th. 2002, that Texan, Swede Hansen. 1992, Memphis legend Tojo Yamamoto. And 1968, one of the greatest shooters of all time, George Hackenschmidt. All right, enough of the sad stuff. Let's go ahead and look at title changes and big moments for this day in pro wrestling history. Let's start off in 1920. Paul Bowser defeats Billy Schroeder in Newark, Ohio for the American middleweight title. 1939, Octavio, easy for you to say, Gano, recognized as the world middleweight champion by EMLL, defeats National Wrestling Association world middleweight champion Gus Calo in Mexico City, Mexico. Gano became the first NWA World Middleweight Champion with this win, which was upon EMLL's entrance as a member of the NWA. Moving on up to 1942, Marshall Estep defeats Steve Brody to win the Midwest Wrestling Association World Junior Heavyweight title in St. Joseph, Missouri. This began and ended each man's second reign. Staying in 1942, Wild Bill Longson defeats Sandar Savo in St. Louis, Missouri to win the NWA World Heavyweight title. This would be the first of 3 title reigns for Longson. Moving on to 1943 and sticking with Billy Longson, he defeats Bobby Mangoff for the National Wrestling Association World Heavyweight title in Houston, Texas to begin his second reign. Moving on to 1948, Wayne Martin wins the Southwest Junior Heavyweight title from Al Getz in Amarillo, Texas. 6 years later, in 1954, the Japan Wrestling Association held an event in Sumo Hall in Tokyo, Japan. The main event sees Masahiko Kimura and Ricky Dozen fight Ben and Mike Sharp to a 1-1 draw in a 2 out of 3 falls match. 1957, Wilbur Snyder wins the Chicago NWA United States Heavyweight title in Chicago, Illinois from Hans Schmidt. This made Snyder the first 2-time champion. A year later in 1958, Mr. Moto defeats Sandar Savo for the Alaskan Heavyweight title in Anchorage, Alaska. This day in history is not good for Sandar Savo. 1959, Don and Luke Fields defeat the Curacans, Gene and Joe, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, to end their 9th and final Mid-American NWA World Tag Team title reign. 1963, Hiro Matsuda ends Eddie Graham's third Florida NWA Southern Heavyweight title reign in Tampa, Florida. 3 years later, 1966, Cowboy Bill Watts defeats Kenji Shibaya for the San Francisco NWA United States Heavyweight title in San Francisco, California, ending Shibaya's second reign. Moving on, 1968, New York City, New York, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation held its first event in the fourth and current incarnation of Madison Square Garden. The previous Madison Square Gardens opened up in 1879, 1890, and 1925, respectively. The new MSG had opened officially 2 days earlier. The main event sees World Heavyweight Champion Bruno Sammartino defeat Bull Ramos by submission. 1969, Gene Knitsky wins the Hawaiian NWA North American Heavyweight title from Turo Tanaka in Honolulu, Hawaii. Disco ducking into the 70s, 1970, the Great Kajuki defeats El Medico in Bakersfield, California for the Los Angeles NWA Pacific Coast Heavyweight title. 1976, Bob Geigel and Akio Sato defeat Ken Mantell and Ron Bass for the Central States NWA World Tag Team titles in St. Joseph, Missouri. 1978, Stan Frazier and Terry Sawyer defeat Dennis Condrey and Phil Hickerson to win the AWA Southern Tag Team titles in Memphis, Tennessee. The title had been vacated after Norville Austin and Bill Dundee split up as a tag team. Our last stop in the 70s, 1979. Mark Lewin and the Spoiler defeat David and Kevin Von Erich for the NWA American Tag Team titles in Fort Worth, Texas. Moving on to 1983, one of those amazing events at the Philadelphia Spectrum that the WWF used to hold all the time in the 80s. It saw Big John Studd defeat WWF champion Bob Backlund by countout. Backlund retained the title. The Wild Samoans defeat Chief Jay and Jules Strongbow in a 2 out of 3 falls. And the final match of that night sees Andre the Giant, Salvatore Bellomo, Rocky Johnson, Pedro Morales, and Jimmy Snuka defeat Mr. Fuji, Superstar Billy Graham, Don Morocco, Buddy Rose, and Ray Stevens in a 3 out of 5 falls match, 3-1. Now that's a lot of talent in the ring. Moving on to 1990, the WWF held an event at Madison Square Garden with the main event being Brutus Beefcake and WWF champion Hulk Hogan defeating the Genius and Mr. Perfect when Hogan pinned the Genius with the leg drop of doom. 1992, IWCCW runs Monticello, New York. Their main event sees Koko Beware pin Tony Atlas with a flying body press after hitting it after Atlas argued with the ref. Blah, blah, blah. Having trouble speaking today, folks. 1994, the Heavenly Bodies, Jimmy Del Rey and Tom Pritchard, defeat the Rock and Roll Express, Robert Gibson and Ricky Morton, for the Smoky Mountain Wrestling Tag Team titles at the Midwest Territorial Wrestling event in Taylor, Michigan. This began the Body's second reign and ended the Express's sixth. 1995, WCW held its 5th annual Super Brawl pay-per-view event at the Baltimore Arena in Baltimore, Maryland, before 13,390 fans. The show got a .95 buy rate. The main event sees WCW World Heavyweight Champion Hulk Hogan, with Jimmy Hart, defeat WCW United States Champion Vader by disqualification to retain his title when Hogan attacked Flair, who was interfering. And last but not least, 1999, AAA held its first annual Reina de Reinas, and I know I butchered that, but in English it means Queen of Queens tournament at Arena Puebla in Puebla, Mexico. In the tournament final, Hamada defeats Miss Jeneth, Esther Monroe, and Rosie Monroe to win the crown. And those are all your big title changes and big moments for this day in professional wrestling history, February 19th. I hope you're all having an amazing day, and remember, you are loved and you are important. See you tomorrow.